Everyone, good evening. So my apologies for being a little scattered. Our learning this evening is dedicated to the memory of my nephew, who passed away a few days ago from cancer after a very long and difficult and valiant struggle with cancer. His name was Eitan Shenkman, and his Hebrew name was Eitan ben Shlomit Ze'ev, and he's a wonderful young man. And I dedicate our learning this evening to his memory. And thank you all for that. So last week we talked about Rav Kook's origins in Eastern Europe, and what we saw was that he was not any sort of conventional Zionist, certainly not prior to his coming to Eretz Israel. He was never a conventional Zionist his whole life, and indeed Zionism, which of course his engagement with Zionism is something, is sort of what makes him such a central figure in Israeli society and history, grew out of a very large set of preoccupations, some of which seem not to be obviously related to Zionism at all, and some of them were very straightforward theological questions, like how does an omnipresent God manifest himself in a very finite and limited world? Like, what is the relationship between body and soul in a world that, bodies were also created by God? Questions of the relationship between Jewish and non-Jewish ethics and universal longings for God, as well as particular longings for God, as well as, in addition to these large theological questions, he's very engaged in a lot of the questions of his time. Remember, we said, like, key biographical facts is that so many of the very celebrated revolutionaries and people who are overthrowing Jewish tradition in the name of new ideologies like Zionism or Jewish nationalism or socialism, etc., were people who had been classmates of his and childhood friends of his, and people with whom he'd had very long conversations about things, and people whom he knew were great idealists and were not simply couldn't easily be characterized as just people going off the derech, as we say these days. And so in 1904, in the summer of 1904, he moves to Eretz Israel, moves to Palestine, and to the city of Jaffa, old and venerable city. Now, 1904, you remember Tel Aviv isn't around yet. Tel Aviv doesn't come around until 1909, the earliest, which is to say, the capital of, so to speak, the new Jewish community of the land of Israel, what was known as the new Yeshuva Chadash, was Yafo. So Yafo is not just this like ancient and nice city. Yafo is this bustling port center. Yafo is the center of commerce. Yafo is the place where people are meeting. It's the nerve center of this new kind of Jewish identity, a new kind of Jewish collective existence that's starting to take shape in the land of Israel, right? It is the metropolis. It's the metropolis that is in touch with the different agricultural settlements surrounding in the general areas, whether they are in the Shfela, what at the times Petach Tikva and Yehud and that sort of thing, or a bit farther north, Zichron Yaakov, and all kinds of other places like that. Now, 1904 is an important year in Zionist history because it's generally seen as the year of the second Aliyah, right? Classical Zionist historiography sort of traces the history of pre-1948 Israel. It periodizes it through 5 aliyot, 5 ascents, 5 waves of migration. The first one, according to sort of classical Zionist historiography, starts in 1880. And of course, there's lively debates as to whether it starts as late as that or as early as that, and a lot of this depends on how you find Zionism and so forth. But there's no denying that, however you number them, different waves of immigration have different sorts of character. And something we'll talk about a lot is that the second Aliyah has a very it's a large number of people, and it's a very ideological character, right? Not most of the tachlis, most of the people coming on Aliyah and the second Aliyah, as I mentioned last week, are people who are fleeing poverty and persecution. And we're talking about the Ashkenazi Jews, people fleeing poverty and persecution in the Russian Empire, and many of them are attracted to the land of Israel either because that's where they were able to get, and they couldn't get to America, or because they were a bit more traditional minded and it seemed easier to maintain a traditional life in Eretz Israel than in the United States, which was true. But there was a hardcore of several thousand really passionately committed, ideologically driven individuals of the second Aliyah. We'll be talking a little bit more about them in a moment. But in general, Rav Kook, back already in Eastern Europe, much of his writing, works that he published at the time, and works that he never published in his lifetime, including one that came out just a few years ago, that was published under the title Linvuchei Hador, which won sort of to the perplexed of the generation, because it was known that in his time in Eastern Europe, he worked on a book that he saw as a kind of as Maimonides has written the Guide for the Perplexed in the 12th century, to help steer Jewish intellectuals of the time through navigating their respective commitments to traditional Judaism on the one hand, and medieval philosophy, Greek philosophy as received through medieval Arabic philosophy on the other, reconciling those traditions. So he was setting out to reconcile modern thought with commitment to traditional Jewish life. While he sort of makes a lot of use of medieval Jewish thought, the currents that he had in mind were things like the theory of evolution and the historical study of religion and issues of moral universalism and that sort of thing. Now, he's still very engrossed in those issues, and he's very committed to conveying to younger generations, to these young intellectuals who are coming to Palestine, that Jewish tradition has something to say to them, and that Jewish tradition, properly understood, very much resonates with what they themselves are up to. Now, the first sort of sally that he has here, and it's his first very small bit of public controversy, starts shortly after he arrives. Okay, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. Shortly after he arrives, just a few months after he arrives. Now, Bruria, if you wouldn't mind opening up the PowerPoint, and actually, if you could open to slide 3. Can you do that, please? Right. Not slide 1, not slide 2. We'll get back to that in a moment, but slide 3. Right. Okay. So Rav Kook comes to Eretz Yisrael, and just a few months after he arrives in 1904, Theodor Herzl dies. A large and momentous event. Herzl dies at a young age, in his mid-40s. Now, he eulogizes Theodor Herzl. A memorial service for Herzl is held in Jaffa in a bank, a sort of branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank, which was the bank that was very affiliated with the Zionist movement. And several local dignitaries speak, and he speaks there as well. Now, this was not an obvious move for a rabbi to make, right? Because, as we said last time, most Orthodox rabbis at the time were very opposed to Zionism. And Rav Kook was a new man in town. Now, in this eulogy that he gives for Herzl, he casts Herzl and his project in terms of these philosophical issues that I was talking about before. In particular, the relationship of body and soul. What do I mean? Well, as I said early on, Rav Kook was very preoccupied. From early on, he's preoccupied with questions of the relationship to the body, the relationship to the soul and the mind. That's part of why he was so obsessed with the mitzvah of tefillin, because tefillin seems to be like a physical linkage between the human body and the divine mind, especially tefillin shel rosh. Now, in terms of ideas of Jewish history, remember, another thing I said earlier was that, those rabbis who were interested in Zionism, right? Those rabbis who were interested in Zionism were interested in Zionism because Zionism was a very secular movement in many ways. We're interested in Zionism for what the social, political, economic betterment it could bring to the Jews, but didn't want to hear about Zionism as a movement for cultural revival, right? That this movement is somehow was going to revive Jewish culture. Also, what's Jewish culture? Anyway, there's Torah, there's mitzvot. What's this thing, culture? The leader of cultural Zionism, if we please could see that slide again, Faria, if you wouldn't mind. The leader of Jewish cultural Zionism was Asher Ginsburg, known by his pen name, Ahad Ha'am. Right? So Ginsburg, as I'm sure many of you know, was an extremely important figure. He's also given one in sort of this very classical kind of like biographical pattern. He was born in a traditional home, received a very classic rabbinic education, early on started reading philosophy and history and that sort of thing, and left traditional religious observance, but was still deeply committed to his Jewish identity and was a Jewish nationalist and a Jewish cultural nationalist. Now, he also was an extremely important figure in the revival of modern Hebrew literature. We're going to talk a little bit about Eliezer ben Yehuda, who of course is most identified with the revival of Hebrew, but it's important to recognize that Eliezer ben Yehuda resurrects Hebrew as a spoken language. Now, Hebrew as a written language, of course, had never died because Hebrew was the language of communication among the Jewish rabbinic and intellectual elite and business elites and so forth throughout history. Right, the same way for many centuries, Latin was the language of Catholic elites, and in the Islamic world, High Arabic, what today is called modern standard Arabic, or classical Arabic, was the language of communication among elites. It's a very common phenomenon to have what was called diglossia, high language and a low language, vernacular language. Now, through human history. Now, but Hebrew modernizes as a written language starting in the late 18th, 19th century, adapts itself to modern grammar and syntax and also to modern forms. And Ahad Ha'am is crucial there because he's one of the inventors of the modern Hebrew essay. And interestingly, Ahad Ha'am very much was a great admirer of British culture and literature and very much models the essays that he wrote, especially in his journal Hashiloach, on British literary essays. And Hashiloach was I mentioned this like very lively Hebrew Yiddish periodical culture of the time. Ahad Ha'am's journal, Hashiloach, was a central organ of Jewish intellectual and cultural life in Central and Eastern Europe. And indeed, reading articles in Hashiloach was one of the ways in which young Rav Kook gained his education in literature and philosophy and all that kind of thing. Now, Ahad Ha'am, again, was somebody who thought that Jewish life in Europe was done, and it needed somehow to be revived, not necessarily politically, but that one needed to create a Jewish cultural center in the land of Israel, right? That one needed to develop a community in the land of Israel, which would be culturally vital, which would be in modern Hebrew, producing modern literature, modern philosophy, and some institutions of its own, right? And that would serve sort of as a nucleus of a broader Jewish cultural renaissance around the world. Now, Ahad Ha'am had a philosophy of history. He thought, again, he was a Jewish nationalist. He thought that there was such a thing as a Jewish spirit and that the Jewish spirit existed across time, was instantiated through the Jewish people. On the slide, you'll see there's one of the most famous quotes attributed to him: more than that Israel has kept the Sabbath has kept Israel. So it's a nifty little quote, but you see the idea here is that the point is Israel. The point is the Jewish people, right? And halacha is once upon a time what kept the Jewish people, and now something else will keep the Jewish people. But what is this thing, the Jewish people? And he said it's a spirit, and the Jewish people is a people that is fundamentally moral, right? There is such a thing as Jewish national spirit that exists over the centuries, over time and place, and it's fundamentally about teaching morality. And Jewish history had a role in that. Why? In a very famous essay called Basar Ruach, Flesh and Spirit, Ahad Ha'am argued that what was Jewish history? The Jewish history of the Bible, the Jewish people in the time of the Bible are very embodied, right? That's when the Jewish people come to be as a people in their own land. And as we know, the Bible is a very bodily book, right? It's full of wars and sex and food and all kinds of things, right? A conventionally religious person would never write it. That was the religion that it needed. And that was the religion that arose, and that's how God spoke into the world. And that with the destruction of the temples, there's ushered in a new period. Unlike many Zionists, Ahad Ha'am is actually a great fan of Rabbinic Judaism in its time, right? Because the rabbis, to his mind, are the people who managed successfully to achieve and realize a kind of Judaism that was spiritual, that wasn't necessarily tied to, like, the synagogue is a kind of portable sanctuary that you can take from place to place to place, and the rabbis developed personal ethics and personal moral responsibility as the hallmark of Jewish life, and that is the Judaism that we need to retransplant back into the land of Israel. Now, Rav Kook engages with Ahad Ha'am's ideas, but along with a different set of traditional ideas. You'll notice that in the slide there was this question of Herzl as Messiah ben Joseph. What is Messiah ben Joseph? Well, we're familiar from traditional Jewish literature about Messiah, the son of David, Mashiach ben David, right? Now, in rabbinic literature, there's a reference to a secondary messianic character known as Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, the son of Joseph, who dies. Mashiach ben Yosef dies and is sort of the predecessor to the final arrival of Mashiach ben David. Now, I'm terribly sorry to do this, but I see my battery is really running out. I just need to go get a block. We've had some technical difficulties here at home. I need to get a power block, and I'll be back in 30 seconds. Buri, if you could please just like put up. Who is this figure Mashiach ben Yosef? Already when he's in Eastern Europe in his notebooks, Rav Kook writes this marvelously suggestive idea that, well, maybe Mashiach ben Yosef is a kind of political redemption for the Jewish people. And Mashiach ben David is a universal moral redemption for all the human race. It's a lovely idea. He then takes this and ties it to Ahad Ha'am's idea. How? Okay, we know in philosophy, right? We remember from philosophy 101, there's the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? You have one thing, and then it leads to its opposite, and then you put the two of them together, and they reconcile into a greater whole, right? He argues in his eulogy for Theodor Herzl that Jewish history is to be understood dialectically as the dialectical relationship of body and soul. Step one of Jewish history is the religion of the Bible, right? The Judaism of the Bible, very embodied, very national, very all those sorts of things. Step two is the Judaism of exile, the Judaism of the Galut, the Judaism of the rabbis, etherealized, spiritualized, mobile. Also, crucially, it's a Judaism in which Jews don't have political power, so they don't have the moral temptations of political power, right? So Jews can like have the most far-reaching moral ideas. Now, for Ahad Ha'am, it kind of ends there, and you do come back to Zion, but leaving God out of it. For Rav Kook's, no. The third step, so Mashiach ben Yosef is the resurrection of the Jewish body, right? The Jewish body needs to be aroused. For Ahad Ha'am, the Jewish spirit can come just sort of hop back to Palestine and create universities and cultural centers, and that's great. And Rav Kook says, no, the Jewish body needs to be revived. The Jewish body is revived through, and this is the concept of Mashiach ben Yosef. The political revival of Zionism is about the revival of the Jewish body, so that the ultimate synthesis is a new synthesis of body and soul, which combines them both and transcends them, and that is the new Judaism of the land of Israel. And so Jewish history is the working out of a philosophical problem, the relationship of body and soul, right? And this is also why the death of Mashiach ben Yosef is kind of predetermined, because the body sort of rediscovers itself, and then it has to yield to the kingdom of the spirit, but a spirit that is, so to speak, absorbed into the spirit. And this is what the Zionist movement is. Now, it's a heady set of ideas to deliver in one eulogy. And what's kind of remarkable in this eulogy is that he doesn't mention Theodor Herzl's name even once. On the one hand, of course, he doesn't have to, because after all, they're there to eulogize Herzl. And it's a way of steering clear of, if any of his rabbinic colleagues might say, well, what are you doing eulogizing this freethinker? You could say, well, of course, I never actually mentioned him by name, but the point is he doesn't have to, right? He's created a philosophical structure for understanding Zionism in which the actual physical person of Theodor Herzl ceases to matter. What matters is his role in this great historical drama. Now, Brewery, if you wouldn't mind going back to the PowerPoint and showing us the that's slide number 2. Right. Now, a freethinker whom he did mention by name, and which was not this one, the previous. Yes, first controversy. First because his eulogy for Theodor Herzl came and went and it wasn't terribly controversial. Not long thereafter, he did get into controversy regarding Eliezer ben Yehuda. Eliezer ben Yehuda, again, who we know is like the person who revives Hebrew as a modern spoken language, and he was like a very iconoclastic figure. He was an extremely rebellious man, Eliezer ben Yehuda. He, by the time Rav Kook had showed up in Eretz Yisrael, Eliezer ben Yehuda had been antagonizing rabbis and traditional Jews in Palestine for decades. And interestingly, he also, remember, in those years, the Zionist movement had what was called the Uganda controversy, and there was a possibility of the Jews being maybe not getting Palestine, but being able to establish some sort of British colony in East Africa. And it was discussed seriously back and forth. Rav Kook himself, in his writings in Eastern Europe, said, it's it's a tenable position. One could argue it, which again is kind of remarkable in light of his later views, as we'll see. Now, in the course of the Uganda controversy, 1905, Eliezer ben Yehuda writes a newspaper article where he says, one of the things that what I can't stand is that one of the accusations made against people who support the Uganda program, like I do, and again, because the people who support it said, look, what are the odds of our getting a Jewish state or anything like that here in Palestine? But the British are willing to give us this. Because this is a really important point to remember. Sitting here today, you and I and all of us know that Eliezer ben Yehuda, you might say, Eliezer ben Yehuda just wait a few years, then the Ottoman Empire isn't going to be there, and the British are going to be the Balfour Declaration, everything will be fine. They don't know that. Right? It's really important. I know it's a trivial point, but it's something I drive home to my students all the time. The people whom we study, historical actors, they don't know how it's all going to turn out. Okay, so Eliezer ben Yehuda says, everybody says people like me and people like me are turning our backs on Jewish history, and then other people like me say, no, we're not turning our backs on Jewish history. We're faithful to Jewish history. And Eliezer ben Yehuda says, no, we aren't. You bet I'm turning my back on Jewish history. Of course we're turning our backs on Jewish history. What is this whole thing? Zionism is a rebellion against tradition. Reviving Hebrew as a spoken language is a rebellion against tradition, right? It's supposed to be a sacred language, but I want to use it to buy groceries. Okay? So, Rav Kook then writes a public letter to Eliezer ben Yehuda saying, no, dear Eliezer and dear friends, don't say you're turning your backs on Jewish history. We're not turning our backs on Jewish history. We're revitalizing Jewish history in a new and different and interesting kind of way, so please don't think of yourselves that way. Eliezer ben Yehuda himself is not impressed. What does this cleric want from me? And let him go talk to somebody who might, possibly believe him. But other people who notice are the rabbis of Jerusalem. And they, in response to this, write an open letter to Rav Kook saying, wait a second, what do you mean we? How can you talk about these young, chalutzim, these young pioneers, and say we, right? What's more, why are you even bothering to answer Eliezer ben Yehuda? And in a mix of condescension and politeness, they say, well, you're the new kid around here, so you don't know how terrible he is, and you don't know how terrible these people are, right? That must be why you're being nice to them, because you can't really mean to be nice to these people, can you, right? So you see the lines are starting to get drawn. Rav Kook is starting to put himself in the middle between the rabbinic establishment and the New Palestine. And he's trying to reach out to the New Palestine by an understanding of them that he's trying to develop himself. Now, because what he's also developing is a series of ideas about tolerance. Early on in arriving in Palestine, he writes in his journals, I need to open myself up. If God is putting all kinds of experiences in front of me, he says, I seem to have the kind of soul that's able to talk to lots of different kind of people and that can capture influences and just my antennae are up, is the phrase we use, right? I seem to have this ability to understand a lot of things that are going on around me, and so let it come. Let all these ideas wash over me, right? And he starts developing ideas of tolerance, but a certain kind of tolerance. And now I'm going to show you a text. Some of his ideas of tolerance. Right? Here's a letter that some years later he writes to one of his students. Now, for him, nowadays we talk a lot about tolerance, we talk about pluralism, we talk about toleration, right? And we saw last time Rav Kook saying, that Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, right? The rabbinic disagreement and controversy and multiplies peace in the world because it's genuine disagreement about understanding God's truth, and God is large enough to make peace between opposing truths. Rav Kook has this conception of tolerance, but his tolerance isn't splitting the difference. Right? His tolerance is grounded in recognizing that God is large and the truth is large, right? Tolerance is the fountain of life, but that is when it comes from the purity of knowledge and ethics, which can only be explicated by lucid awareness of the essence of the life of the people and its life-giving soul. In other words, tolerance is about vitality. Tolerance is not about, well, we'll split the difference because these differences don't really matter. No, differences matter because they're coming from people. When people are expressing who they really are, that really matters. But accepting that God is everywhere and God is a God of life means God is sort of bubbling through all people who are arguing in good faith, right? So when tolerance comes from faint-heartedness and weakness of spirit, it is poisonous and destructive, and brings in the end jealousy, bitter and hard as death. Excuse me. Okay. These proponents will be precisely those who speak in the name of tolerance, right? Oh, don't believe in anything all that much. The kind of tolerance that seeks to stop up the vigor of life is like that of someone who sees his home and family open to being trampled by every wanton and loose character, and in his weakness equivocates and is silent. He doesn't advocate not having opinions. You need to have a point of view but again, it's one that is explicated by lucid awareness of the life of the people and its life-giving soul, the purity of knowledge and ethics. Think about what you're thinking. Think about, am I saying what I really think is true? Do I think this is good? Do I think this is moral? Do I think this is right? If that's the case, then go for it. But recognize that God will always be greater. And God is always greater than you, and God may be speaking through the other person too. Crucial to the stance that he's developing is also his rejection of anger. Right? This is a very powerful passage from his notebooks. Rav Kook almost never says that he hates anything. But this is one of the only times in his writings that he uses the word hate. We must hate anger with all the depth of our being, with great anger but moderate and settled. We must hate the spiritual anger that jumbles the mind and invalidates all the advantages of being human, individual, and collective. And this is crucial, especially, I might add, for the world of 2020. When we see any group always expressing itself in anger, it's a sign that it has no understanding, no content with which to fill its emptiness, that in truth it's angry with itself, but that egoism, and that's the word he uses, egoism comes and forces it to deposit the venom of its anger on others, right? When you see people who are just angry all the time and without a constructive idea, that happens so much in political debate today, right? People are just angry about different things. And when you say, well, but what do you actually propose? And the answer is Stop, don't you see I'm trying to be angry here? Right? For Rav Kook, pure anger, and there's like, we could discuss this at much greater length because he's drawing on Kabbalistic sources about how anger derives from the void, not from life, well, not from where God is, but from where God isn't. I mean, that's a longer and more complicated subject. Like so much in Rav Kook, what seem to be like simply philosophical ideas, and we'll see very clearly are rooted in all sorts of Kabbalistic ideas as we move on a little bit. But when we see people, there's also great psychological insight here. When you see people who are angry all the time, it means that they're empty and they feel their own emptiness, and so they have nowhere to go with it, and all they do is just spew out anger on others. But who are the higher sages who have reached the height of justice and kindness, are full of will and kindness and truth garland them all the day? Now this is also a crucial feature of Rav Kook's teaching. Again, it derives from his readings of the Kabbalah. The spiritual life requires a strong will. Religious life, moral life requires a strong will. You need to develop will. You need to develop strength. When he says this, he's reflecting Kabbalistic ideas in which the very first aspect of God's creation of the universe is God's ratzon. God has a will to create the world. And he's also reflecting the philosophical discussions of his time, especially the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, whom he read. And who exercised a huge influence on Jewish thought and Zionist thought of the time. And Nietzsche argued that religion, and in particular he meant Christianity, was this weak-kneed, pathetic, enervating, demoralizing war against everything that made human beings vigorous and alive. Right? Now, interestingly, Rav Kook is willing to accept that critique of certain kinds of religions, certainly about Christianity, as we'll see, but also about certain kinds of debased forms of rabbinic Judaism, right? He's willing to accept modern critiques of traditional Judaism as having become enervated because he sees in the possibility of new Jewish life in the land of Israel, the possibility of a Jewish life that will combine all the vigor of the body and the beauty of the spirit in a new formation. Right? Now, he's not the only person thinking about these things in different ways. Again, Buri, if you could please just put up the slides again, and then before we hop into some texts, if you wouldn't mind, Buri, if you wouldn't mind, yeah, thank you. Okay. Right. So I will thank you. I appreciate the comments from everyone about making myself better understood. So I'd just like to look, if you could please show slide number 4. And this is just an idea of some of the folks with whom Rav Kook is interacting. These are some of the, not right, if we move on, right, to this one that's labeled the second Aliyah. So you see, the bearded gentleman is Alexander Ziskin Rabinovich, who was a writer known as Azar, who was very close to Achad Ha'am, but was also very traditional. You see, he's dressed in a fairly traditional way. And he was a person who became very close with Rav Kook, and he introduced Rav Kook. He was a literateur, he was a writer, he was an essayist, and all kinds of things. And he introduced Rav Kook to many of the young writers of the time. So, for instance, you see the young man in the light-colored jacket with sort of the high collar and the necktie, right? That is Shmuel Yosef Chashkis, who's better known as Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who, of course, in 1966 won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was moved to Yafo in those years, and he became very close with Rav Kook. The man with his hand on Azar's shoulder, the fellow with the mustache and sort of looking like he hasn't shaved in a few days, in the turtleneck type thing, that's Yosef Chaim Brenner. Yosef Chaim Brenner was a remarkably important writer, and Yosef Chaim Brenner was in many ways the secular saint of the second Aliyah. I mean, he was a magnificent writer, and he was really the voice of much of the idealism of the second Aliyah. Among his very most famous pronouncements is, of course, let us say a few things. There's a few things we can be clear about. The Jewish people have no future. The world is terrible, but also beautiful. People are dreadful, and they are magnificent too. All we can do is unite and, in spite of everything, try to better the lot of the working class. Brenner was the kind of idealist who really fired Rav Kook's imagination and who he very much was trying to reach, right? Brenner would regularly respond to Rav Kook's writings with articles and reviews and essays of his own. And interestingly, he fiercely rejected, he was like a lot of, like, say, friends of his, like he was very close with Agnon. Agnon was very enamored of Rav Kook and had a lot to do with him. Brenner was much more skeptical because, Rabbi, I don't want to be part of your spiritual revolution. I'm doing a revolution of my own. And the relations between Rav Kook and Brenner are fascinating. The fellow with his hand on Brenner's shoulder is David Shimoni, who's also another writer of the Second Aliyah. Now, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Buri, if you wouldn't mind just moving on to the next slide. One other figure of the Second Aliyah is really important is Aaron David Gordon. Aaron David Gordon, if Rav Kook was an old man for the Second Aliyah, he was 38 years old when he came. Gordon was practically ancient because he was in his late 40s when he came. As you see, he's a traditional Jew by his upbringing and education, very learned. And you see, he's dressed as a peasant, right? Gordon is somebody who actually walked the walk. He came on Aliyah in his mid-40s, an intellectual, and actually went to work in the fields. And developed a remarkably rich philosophy of nationalism and spirituality, and famously of labor, right? He was the person who introduced the idea of avodah, labor, into the Zionist lexicon as something that was both not only like a social and economic value, but a kind of spiritual value. And the more you read Gordon, the more you see he knows exactly the religious resonances of the idea of avodah as worship. And he's deliberately trying to transform it into an ideal of Jewish agricultural life, right? But not in a narrow kind of way, because as he writes in this very famous quote, labor has afflicted us, right? Our absence of labor, our absence of true avodah has afflicted us, and labor will heal us. Labor will heal us because we will return to nature. And Gordon talks a lot about nature in many of the ways that Rav Kook talks about nature, that nature is not just the birds and the trees, nature is becoming who you most truly are. And he seeks to recreate, through a pioneering life in the land of Israel, a new form of Jewishness that in its own way will integrate body and soul, in ways that are spiritually very charged, but unlike Rav Kook, without God and without halacha, right? Like Rav Kook, he's very alive to the ethical perils of nationalism. Unlike Rav Kook, he thinks that Jewish nationalism can be just as cruel as any other kind of nationalism, and so needs to be careful. We'll see Rav Kook has a different idea of Jewish nationalism. And finally, if we could just show you, if I could just move on to the last two slides, if you wouldn't mind moving forward. This is just what Rav Kook looked like during his years in Yaffo. And interestingly, during those years, he began to sign his letters with the signature. Before he would write his name, Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, and write underneath it, Eved La'am Kadosh Al Admat Kodesh, right? The servant of a holy people on a holy land. He also opened up a yeshiva. He opened a small yeshiva in the Neve Sha'anan neighborhood of Jaffa. Neve Sha'anan is nowadays this like very ritzy, gentrified place. It wasn't for a very long time. His yeshiva was, you see, is on the rooftop of a building. Now, what's interesting is that in this yeshiva, he actually tried to implement some of his ideas, in which you had students there. The curriculum wasn't just Talmud. The curriculum alongside Talmud was philosophy, was Bible, was literature, right? And what's interesting is that also in his letters to other rabbis describing his educational ideas, he very much internalizes the criticisms that were made of traditional rabbinic education. It was like he has there's like one very important rabbi named Isaac Halevi, with whom he has long correspondences where Isaac Halevi keeps asking him, how come rabbis like you aren't just standing up for tradition in Yaffo? And he says, you don't get it. Nobody's going to listen to us because we look stooped and we look tubercular and we have no idea how to deal with the modern world. And we need new kinds of rabbis, right? So it's part of his program. Now, if we could please, now I'm going to go to share screen and we will start looking at some texts, okay? So now I'm going to screen share with you all? Okay, so now I'm screen sharing. Do you all see these texts? Right. Now, Rav Kook starts writing in these years, again, in his notebooks and elsewhere, about Jewish nationalism. Knesset Yisrael, and again, Kabbalistic designation for the land, for the Jewish people, is the distilled essence of all existence. And in this world, this distillation is developed onto the Israelite nation, truly in its materiality and spirituality, its generations and faith. And the Israelite history is the idealized distillation of general history, and there is no movement in the world, in all the peoples, whose like is not to be found. So he validates Jewish nationalism, but again, he doesn't want Jewish nationalism to be like any other kind of nationalism. Now notice he doesn't say Am Yisrael, he says Knesset Yisrael, and that's a Kabbalistic term. In the Kabbalah, Knesset Yisrael, that designation for the Jewish people, is a synonym. It's a synonym for Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. It's also a synonym for Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, and it's a synonym for the Shekhinah, or like the presence of God, God's immanent presence in the world. God closest to hand. What do all those have in common? They are the meeting point of God with the world. The meeting point of divinity in the world is the Shekhinah, is the Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? When the heavenly revealed Torah is articulated by human beings and interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted and then lived by human beings. And the Jewish people as a physical live people, God's people on earth, and the land of Israel is a real live land where that people dwells. Now also in the Kabbalah, you know, it's not just a bunch of synonyms, there's a structure to these Kabbalistic ideas. Some of you are probably familiar, the idea of the Sfirot, right? That there is a sort of an internal divine structure to the universe, and the universe is structured by clusters of divine energies. And the one called Knesset Yisrael is, so to speak, the one at the bottom of the structure holding it all together. So to speak, all the energies flow in through it and then flow up through it to the divine world. That's what he means when, so to speak, the same way the Shekhinah gathers all the energies from the divine world and brings them down into the world. So the Jewish people gather all the good spiritual energies of the world and make them holy. Now, interestingly, Rav Kook has, before we get back to the agreement, Rav Kook has a very positive view of other cultures. Right? What is this that the Jewish people are gathering from all the other worlds, from all the other nations? The sense of divine faith in all its great strength, that is life, true life, the life that has no death, the life whose joy is unalloyed with any sorrow, grief, or sign. Right? That's what he means by God, by the way, that God is truly alive in the life of the world. That light of life grows and ascends from every teaching, every wisdom, every compassion, every greatness, every good and pleasant conversation, every great and noble idea, every straight and honest thought, every mitzvah, every good deed, every improvement in culture and the way of the world, every good thing in the world at all times and all creatures, all languages, all tongues, and all tendencies, and in all faiths, in all the worlds, in all the souls, from all it draws, and unto all it flows, the kulo omer kavod, and all says the Lord. So for Rav Kook, God is an active force in the world, and God is manifest in everything in the world and in human beings that wants to make the world better. And Torah and mitzvot are ways to channel those energies for the Jews and ways to make us conscious and bring us to awareness of what it is that we are all trying to do, and to make us better able to understand and be receptive to the good things all around us. And he sees Jewish nationalism in that light. This is what the Jewish people, a reborn Jewish people in the land of Israel, are going to do, right? And the land of Israel is what? The land of Israel is the place where body and soul will be reconciled. The holiness within nature is the holiness of the land of Israel. And the Shekhinah, the divine presence, according to the Talmud, went down into exile with Israel is what? The ability to preserve holiness in opposition to nature. Remember his eulogy for Theodor Herzl, right? Thesis, biblical Judaism. Antithesis, Exile Judaism, Judaism that's cut off from nature, cut off from the body, very spiritual, very ethereal. And that's the holiness of exile, and it's genuinely holy. But the holiness that combats nature is not complete or perfect, shalem. It must be absorbed in its higher essence to the higher holiness, which is the holiness in nature itself, which is the foundation of the restoration and repair of the world entire. It uses the phrase and its utter fragrancy. Kabbalistic term for the world becoming sweet, the world becoming good. And the holiness in exile will be joined to the holiness of the land. And he quotes the line from the Talmud, and the synagogues in Batei Midrash and Babel will be reestablished in the line. So you see, Eretz Yisrael for him is not just a really important thing, and it's not just a mitzvah, and it's not just where the Jewish people live. Eretz Yisrael is the spiritual center of the world because it's where body and soul are united. Now, interestingly, his conception, though, that this redemption, this stunning vision of redemption is taking place in historical time, also affects his halachic views, and especially in his book, Shabbat Haaretz, the Sabbath of the land. Right? The year 1910, and by this point he's been in Yaakov for about 6 years, 1910 is a Shemitah year. Right? Now, according to the laws of Shemitah, the biblical sabbatical, the land is supposed to lie fallow. Now, what will happen to burgeoning Jewish agricultural settlements if they go out of business for a year? Right? Now, initially in the 1880s, when this first came up, because when Petach Tikva was founded in 1878, so already by the 1880s, when Shemitah was rolling around, you began to have Jewish agriculture in the land of Israel. And what were you going to do? And people had the idea, an idea that's familiar to anyone who's familiar with halachic practice and all kinds of things. Well, Shemitah only applies to lands that are occupied by the Jews. So how about if you just sell your land to a non-Jew? Maybe Shemitah doesn't count there. And this is actually said by very important halachists, including the Yitzchak Kohen Spector, the major Lithuanian posek of the time. Rav Kook, in his treatise Shabbat Haaretz, gives qualified acceptance to what's called Heter HaMechira, the permissive sale of the sabbatical land. The permissive sale of the sabbatical land. And he writes this very learned halachic treatise and about exactly why and how it is that this thing can work, and it should be done in a very limited way and only as a temporary measure. And alongside this, he took great effort to raise money to support Jewish farmers who didn't want to avail themselves of this permissive ruling and who wanted to keep Shemitah as best they could. Also, he had to intervene with the Rothschilds. Because remember, Baron Rothschild owned Zichron Yaakov and was important for all these settlements, Rosh Pinah and the rest. And once Shabbat Haaretz came out, the Baron and his men said, "Oh, okay, well, the rabbi says you people can go on working just like old times." And also he also said only certain prohibitions would be relaxed by the Heter Mechira, but not other prohibitions. And so he had to do battle with the Rothschilds over this. So, but you see here that his historical conception of what the Jewish return to the Holy Land is also shaping his views as a rabbinic decision maker, as a posek, as a decisor of Jewish law. And then the last text I'd like to look at, where you see part of his innovation here is taking these theological ideas and using them to interpret the concrete social and political movements of his time. Right? Maimonides was a great philosopher and theologian, but Maimonides never said, with my philosophy, you can understand why this political party is like that and why that political party is like that, why this vizier is like that, that vizier is like that. To the contrary, Maimonides tells you that my whole philosophical Judaism is to get you out of the world of kings and princes, but into a more spiritual world, right? And ditto for the Kabbalah. And Rav Kook, he's not the very first Kabbalist. I mean, he's preceded in this by, he takes his cue from Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who in the 18th century is already suggesting that the divine process of tikkun takes place in historical time, but he really runs with this. And he also integrates this, though, with a view of the inner spiritual religious life, right? Because remember, he's also talking about how do you navigate, how do you go on believing in divine truth in a very multifarious world, in a world that's characterized by profound disagreement. Here's an extremely important passage where he talks about Jewish politics in his time, which was pretty rough and tumble too. Three forces are now wrestling within our camp. The war is felt more strongly in Eretz Yisrael, but its effects derive from the life of the nation as a whole, and their roots are fixed in an awareness which penetrates the expanses of the human spirit, the sacred, the nation, humanity. These are the three central demands which all life, ours and that of every man in whatever form are composed of. Right? And okay, so he's saying, what is it to be a human being? What are three great motive forces in humanity? The sacred, a relationship to the transcendent, to the divine. The nation, a relationship to the collective and the earthly collective, the people to whom you're physically related, right? The nation gives you language. The nation gives you your ability. How do you understand yourself? You understand yourself in the language that your mother spoke to you, right? And humanity, your sense of yourself as being a member of the human race as a whole. And each one has its own sort of moral directions that emerge from it, right? And they're all real and they're all valid. And what he argues is that in Jewish life today meaning about 1910, 1911, each one has become the property of a party. There's the sacred party, which is orthodoxy. And he spells this out, right? There's the sacred party, the party of the sacred, which is orthodoxy. There's the party of the nation, which is nationalism. And he doesn't just necessarily mean Zionism. Because Rav Kook and elsewhere, he talks about, Zionism was only one form of Jewish nationalism. There were other kinds of Jewish nationalism around. He's most focused on Zionism, of course, but in this particular passage, he talks about in Eretz Yisrael, the conflict is felt most strongly, but the conflict is everywhere, and humanity. People who see themselves as part of the human race and whose moral horizon is one that's dictated by their membership in all humanity. And the problem is that the alienation is in the negative side, which each sees in its fellow, right? I see the other people as negative. I don't appreciate, it's not like, well, he's a crazy nationalist, but he's good to his mother. No, I hate his nationalism. Rav Kook says, no, you should appreciate his nationalism. You, nationalists, you should appreciate the God fervor of the Orthodox, and you should appreciate the moral fervor of the Universalist, and so forth. He asks you to undertake a kind of spiritual reckoning with yourself, to open yourself up to the others, right? I'm talking about specific groups. I'm talking about the Orthodox, as they are generally called, which carries the banner of the sacred. The second is the new nationalism. The third is liberalism. It is well understood that in a healthy situation, all three are needed together. And each should generously appreciate the positive task of the other, right? Now, wait a second. Rabbi, did you just say that the sacred, the Orthodox, is just one party? But isn't that you? So here he clarifies what he means by the Kodesh. Because also this is really important for what he understands by this, how he understands his key religious conception of what is the holy. Our listing the sacred as one of the three, each of whom must at times contract itself for the sake of the other, because he says, Orthodox people, you got to give a little sometimes. Nationalists, you got to give a little sometimes. Universalists, you got to give a little sometimes, because we're all in this together. And we all have to recognize that each of us are actually striving in good faith for good things. By the way, notice who's not on his screen. People who are emigrating Russia and leaving to America and just to make a lot of money are not what he's thinking about. He's maybe thinking about Jewish socialists in America. But the people who he's concerned with and he's talking about are the people who are motivated fundamentally by ideals, whether they are religious ideals, whether they are religious ideals, like obviously religious ideals or social ideals or nationalist ideals. And he says the sacred, right? When I say the sacred is a party, that's just for the technical and practical side, which is to say, but the very heavenly sacred is the broad subject, which is affecting all this contraction. The sacred, the Kodesh, is what courses through and encompasses this and creates these interactions. Like all works that seek to improve the world and life and all their meanings, which all bear their blessings from the sacred. And indeed, elsewhere in this passage, he expressly says, he cites a line from the Zohar. Everything falls under the line of measure, right? Everything in its place. But he uses this specific phrase, Hakol nichnas tachat kav hamidah. If you're familiar with the Kabbalah, you know that kav hamidah, a few minutes ago I talked about the sphirot, this structure of divine energies, this clusters of divine energies that structure the world. And in the Kabbalah, kav hamidah is the axis running through all the seemingly contradictory and diverse divine energies. Torah sheba'al peh, Torah sheba'iktav, male, female. Mercy, law, right? All these things, Jew, non-Jew, right? All these different antinomies in the Kabbalah are sort of held together. They're genuine, they're pulsating with life, but they're held together by this dynamic axis. And he says that is what the sacred is. The sacred is the unity of is the unity to be found within diversity. Not unity within diversity because the differences don't really matter. No, the differences really do matter, but God is really big. And God wants everything to come to every good thing and every principled good thing to come to expression to realize the goodness of his world. And so it's in this light that he's analyzing the Jewish politics of his time. It's in this light that he's analyzing the changes that halacha has to make in order to adapt itself to new Jewish community in the land of Israel. And again, he's seeing this as a pre-messianic era, right? Because all of the contradictions of Jewish history and of Jewish life are coming to the surface. The contradiction between nation and universal and sacred, all these contradictions come to the surface because they're en route to their great resolution. We have some time for questions, and I'd be glad to. I'll just give you a preview of next week. Next week, we're going to see how Rav Kook responds to World War I and the Balfour Declaration. And then what happens when after World War I, he actually tries quite literally to institutionalize these visions of his and the creation of the chief rabbinate and his yeshiva and his participation in the building of the Jewish national home in Palestine and how that legacy of his is understood afterwards. But I'm glad to take questions and discussion. Okay, Ben Waxman asks, how did Rav Kook make the jump, or rather, how did he not simply accept rabbinic antipathy to secular Zionism? Well, as I said, as we talked about a bit more also last week, it comes from a bunch of things. First off, like all great spiritual figures, just like all human beings, we're ultimately mysteries to one another and mysteries to ourselves. And so I'm not going to pretend to explain how someone like Rav Kook comes to be certainly not a figure as remarkable and colossal and extraordinary and complicated as he. That being said, part of it is, a lot of it is because he's very much a man of his times, and he's very alive to the issues of his times. And, he's reading what other people are reading. And the same way other people are concluding that traditional Judaism is in need of some renovation, he comes to that conclusion too. He just doesn't think you need to throw it out, right? And also, remember, he very much accepts that a lot of the people rebelling against tradition are doing so out of deep principle, right? And sort of like, if I were to put it in colloquial terms today, his argument with his rabbinic colleagues is that, Rabbi Sai, a lot of these secular revolutionaries who are rebelling against us, they're not doing this because they want to eat cheeseburgers. Look what they're doing with themselves. They're fighting the Tsar and getting sent to Siberia. They're moving to Palestine and draining swamps and like getting malaria and getting shot at by Arabs. And they're trying to write Hebrew poetry, and they're reading the Bible like crazy, and they're arguing that we didn't do a good enough job taking care of the Jewish poor, and they may be right. But that doesn't mean we have to like throw out everything. And so he sees real possibilities here. So part of it has to do with his own outlook, and when he's talking about willingness to open yourself up to people who disagree with you, he's talking about himself, because this is something that he did, right? If you have, read memoirs of people who were with him in Yaffo in those years. He was talking to all sorts of people and having conversations with all kinds of people. And he was regularly in the Yaffo library. He was reading the books and reading the journals and hearing what people were up to and doing it with great receptiveness. And he was able to do it with great receptiveness because he was also very self-confident. I don't mean self-confident in an arrogant kind of way, but he really believed that God is large. And God's truth is large enough to encompass many, many truths. And that if something as remarkable as this Jewish return to Zionism was happening with, and a lot of good things were happening too, there had to be something good going on here, right? And so that simply accepting the rabbinic antipathy to secular Zionism wasn't for him, but also he never became a member of the Zionist movement. He never really formally allied himself with the Zionist movement, and he had a very hard time with the Mizrahi, which was the religious faction of the Zionist movement. It was founded in 1902, because the Mizrahi, as far as he was concerned, were indeed watering down their Jewishness and their Judaism. that, you know, they were very much willing to accept a kind of secondary status within the larger Zionist movement as a whole, and not make the Zionist movement about spiritual or cultural rejuvenation. And he said, no, 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 this has to be very much about spiritual and cultural rejuvenation, and we maybe have to like strike out and do it on our own. Right? So Ben, I hope that answers your question, at least preliminarily. Anybody have any other questions or comments they'd like to make before we wrap up? Anyone?
Thank you very much, Professor Mirsky.
My pleasure.
And thank you also, I know, for making time for us in these difficult circumstances for you. I hope you have a Tovot, and we'll see everybody here next Sunday for the last chapter of this series.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Buria. And thank you, everyone.